While President Trump continues to have diplomatic negotiations and engagement with Russia, Ukraine, and Europe to try and find some sort of consensus to bring that war to an end, there are other issues that go along with it that also have to be considered. Some of which are, can this agreement even be brought into reality? Have the conditions that have been set up, are they real? Or are they paper deep? And if they were ever even came to fruition and tried to start applying them on the ground, would we discover that there's actually no substance there and the whole thing could fall apart? Even aside from that, there's also the question of how much longer can the Ukraine side continue to put up significant resistance? How long can the Russian side continue to offer significant offensive pressure? And where is the breaking point for that situation here? Things continue to develop on the ground at a little bit more rapid pace than I think many people are aware of, mostly because they're all paying attention to things that are happening in capitals like Washington, Paris, London, Moscow, and Kiev. But as it turns out, things on the battlefield never stop. And that is the case here. And there have been some, really in just the last 36 or so hours, there have been a number of actions that I think are worthy of our attention that shows that things are much more tenuous on the Ukraine side than is commonly believed. As we've talked about many times, there's a number of folks in the West, and especially a lot of these so-called opinion leaders or so-called experts, retired generals and the like, they operate on the assumption that the Ukraine armed forces can continue offering resistance indefinitely. Whether that took 6 months, a year, 3 years, whatever, they don't even seem to take into the possibility that the military could crumble and collapse. They should pay a little bit more attention to the Daniel Davis Deep Dive, because that's why we do this show, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, even if it's something a lot of people don't want to hear. That's what we're going to do today. I'm going to show you a number of clips here and also show you the battle map in a couple of key areas to show you why there is growing trouble on the Ukraine side. Now, as we talked about even before I went on my last trip there, that there had been a penetration a couple of weeks back in the Pokrovsk area by the Russian Federation. They actually had this big punch through that was almost 20 kilometers deep from its start point and about 7 kilometers wide. We wondered at the time whether this was a target of opportunity, whether there was just a break on the Ukraine side and unexpectedly the Russians flooded in to take hold of it, or whether this was a planned operation to where Russia made a penetration and then had exploitation forces ready to punch through, because that's been one of my concerns from the beginning. And as it turns out, the Russians did not exploit that penetration. The Ukraine side sent the Azov Corps, several brigades, to contain the penetration and to attempt to eradicate it. Up to this point, they did contain it, but they have not been able to, even as of this date, eradicate it. So lots of the focus was on there. And of course, one of the big reasons, and maybe the primary reason that Russia was able to be stopped, is because Ukraine pulled the Azov Corps off of the different part of the front to be able to contain that. What that tells you is that there is no theater level reserve that's just waiting like a fire brigade somewhere, not in contact, but there's someplace that can move here and there. Instead, they had to pull people off one part of the line where they calculated that there was the least possibility that Russia would exploit that and push in harder on that. And at least so far, it looks like that's the case. But unfortunately, like the finger in the dye issue, that's not the end of it. And now then we have another penetration that's happening in a couple of different places on top of what's happening still around the Pokrovsk area. We're going to start off in the north to where Denis Davidov, who is a pro-Ukrainian mapper, and he's going to point out that even though he didn't like to say it, there is new trouble in Kupiansk.
I'm speaking about the Kupiansk city in the Kharkiv Oblast, where Russians advanced quite a lot for the last 24 hours. The strategy for the Russian army is the same. They move with sabotage groups, small ones like 2, 3, maximum 5 people. They take the ground in the tree lines, in forest spots. They ambush sometimes Ukrainian forces, and later on Russia advances with their major force, also infantry mostly. But they are equipped with motorcycles, all-terrain vehicles, standard Lada vehicles, which allow them to move very fast. Yes, most of that stuff Ukraine ambushes with the help of the FPV drones, but in many of the cases it's not enough.
Yeah, those are the issues there. And the description that he played for how that actually happened in the Kupiansk area, that is exactly what the Russians did in the Pokrovsk area. So what this shows you is that Russia is evolving tactically. The way they go about their doctrine, how they employ themselves, is adjusting based on things that work, and they're stopping to do things that don't work. These so-called human meat wave tactics, which Russia was accused of earlier, were never really done. Certainly didn't have any evidence of that other than just claims, but no video evidence of these massive movements of Russian forces and getting slaughtered, etc. And in fact, when you look at the amount of bodies that have been transitioned back and forth between the two sides, it's like 10 to 1, 20 to 1. Huge advantage from the Russians providing bodies back to the Ukraine side rather than the other way around. And if there were these meat wave attacks, there would be a massive number of Russian bodies to repatriate, and there hasn't. So that's likely was never the case here. But what you see him talk about here is they call these DRG, which is kind of like advanced cavalry organizations you might hear in the United States. Sabotage and reconnaissance groups. They'll go in small numbers, sometimes as few as 2 and 3 people, maybe sometimes as many as 5. But they don't present a big target, so you can bring a lot of firepower and try to take them out if you see them. But it's a lot easier to slide small numbers of people through there. They will then take specific and tactically important spots. Then they will bring some other people back up on around it. If you don't have enough infantry of your own to take care of that, because on the surface of it, you may think, well, a handful of guys, 3 to 5, that's easy to take care of. Well, the fact that the Ukraine side isn't taking care of it is evidence that they have an insufficient number of infantrymen. We keep talking about that over and over. Now you're seeing it play out. First in Pokrovsk, and then now here in the Kupiansk area. And in both cases, they're trying to send reinforcements to block the penetration, but they're running low on reinforcements. They used, by one account, 4 brigades to stop the Pokrovsk penetration. So that means that they took what little they had and a pretty substantial number of them to block those penetrations there. But even there, and we'll get to this in a second, they still haven't been able to seal off this penetration. They just stopped Russia from going up in further. But as you heard Dennis talking about here, the Russian side started with these small DRG groups, and then they started moving regular infantrymen up, meaning, again, Ukraine was not able to, when they recognized what was happening, they did not have the ability to rapidly move mobile defense forces to try and cut the invaders out, to try and take out these DRG groups before they got a toehold. Instead, Russia was able to bring more forces in to move around there. And let me now show you actually where this is on a map. So this is the Eastern Front here. This is where most of the stuff's taking place here. And here, let me zoom in on the Kupiansk area, because you can see what he was talking about here, that Russia had moved, first of all, with just DRG forces in, but now then much larger. They've expanded what they had outside here. They continue. These are the gray zones. You see that Russia is moving up into these are now contested inside the city of Kupiansk here. They're inside the city. This is further in here, moving in more from this direction as well. So when you pull it back out here, there was some reports that some of the other DRG groups were further in here. They haven't colored the map red yet there because it's unclear what's going on. But you see there are not many routes left in. That's one of the big problems here, is that this road here, this M26 road, it has effectively been brought under fire control. So you really can't use this to bring supplies in to the Ukraine side. So they have to go on smaller roads or in some of these areas right here. So Russia is probably going to continue to put pressure on in the south. And the thing that makes the most sense is that they would not try to go in, take the city, by block, as you see that, there's a number of these are all streets, and every one of those little dots you can see there, those are all buildings that they would have to take, house by house if they wanted to take the city that way. But that doesn't make any sense. You can also see all around here as well. But if they were able to move here and physically cut this line, and then if they were able to take this one, because this smaller road here, this black road going in, this is right now is one of the last remaining routes into the entire thing. So that means that Russia can already focus its aerial assets and reconnaissance drones to try and interdict anything that comes in here. And so that's going to just methodically squeeze the supplies ammunition, food, medical reinforcements, moving troops back and forth in, etc., it's going to make it much, much more difficult. So the city itself is in growing risk and growing danger. Let's now, actually, no, let me stick where I'm at right there. Let's roll down to, I talked about the Kupiansk, the Pokrovsk area. Let's go and take a look at this. This is the area. You may recall that when the original penetration went, it did go to this direction here, but there was another tandem push up in this area. This is where the Ukraine side was successful, able to push them back, but they were not able to penetrate this one. So Russia continues to reinforce this penetration here and hold the flanks, because you see the Ukraine side in these gray zones, they're trying to push through and they're trying to cut this off. Ideally, they would like to cut it off down here at the very base so that then they can trap all of the Russian soldiers in here and they would either be captured or killed. Russia is aware of these risks and they're continuing to contest this area and to continue to move reinforcements. Meanwhile, over to the right flank, or just barely to the right flank here, in Shakove and Volodymyrivka, sorry about that, you can see that the Russians are pushing further up into there. If the Russians are able to take these two as well, then that's going to put the Ukraine side in a position to where its troops could be cut off, and they will either have to withdraw further up to these two villages or out of the pocket entirely. So it's a battle right now. Who's going to have the most troops to conduct offensive operations? As you know, as many are aware, it's a lot more expensive to have offensive operations than it is to have the defensive, because you have to get out in the open to fight. Russia has the number of troops apparently to hold these and to do the offensive. It remains to be seen whether the Ukraine side has enough to continue to try and do an offensive here, try to do defensive here, and hold these areas in here. It's really asking a lot if you're already undermanned, as we've seen described by Denis Davidov there in the Kupiansk area, and as we already know, in this area. And of course, that even inside Pokrovsk itself, Russia continues to put pressure all along these lines in these gray zones, and especially over here on the outskirts of Mirnograd, the pressure just continues to be put. It remains to be seen here how much longer the Ukraine side can hold, because you see that's already in a semi-cauldron right here, and in the Konstantinivka area, just adjacent to it, in the Chasiv Yar area, Russian troops are now pushing out from there, moving it forward. You see that some of the gray zones here are extending in towards the city of Konstantinivka itself, right up to the outskirts. So just everywhere you want to look in this area, Russia is putting pressure on the Ukraine side. Now, if that were not enough, there is some other areas where they continue to put pressure and add new pressure, and that is in the south, in the Zaporizhia area, as military summary here explains.
According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the city by the name of Stepnogorsk. The Russians managed to break through completely Ukrainian defense in the village by the name of Plavny, to cross some water barriers and to enter the western part of the city of Stepnogorsk. We came to this conclusion based on the video published by pro-Ukrainian resources. In this video we can see how exactly the Russians were moving and what kind of buildings the Russians captured. Later, when the Ukrainians discovered positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation, they began bombing them with aviation. So several positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation were destroyed, but we have no records that confirm Ukraine control over this territory. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map. The territory in this area looked like this yesterday by the end of the 24th of August of 2025, and by the morning of the 26th of August, we colored the territory as is. Furthermore, we believe that in coming hours, the Russians will finish the battle for the settlement of Plavny. And most likely the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm this information. We will adjust this territory completely. So as you can see, the Russians answered the settlement of Stepnogorsk from many directions, and it seems that the battle for the village is going to start in coming days or maybe even hours.
So that was actually yesterday. Let me show you an updated map of that area right now. And you can see Stepnogorsk, and this is right here. This is where he was talking about here. And the Russians continue to push up into these now the gray zones here. Let me tell you why this is important, because this road right here runs up into Zaporizhia city itself. And if Russia continues to move along this course, if this is actually indicating a new offensive move, then this is going to put even more pressure on the Ukraine side, because the city of Zaporizhia is one that's never been in Russian control here. And this, of course, is one of the main routes in there. They have several in the south here. But if Russia is able to move them in there, that could put yet another city at risk of Russian troops. The question is that we don't have the answer to right now. Does Russia have enough to conduct an offensive basically in three major areas along the line of contact? We know, of course, that there's continual pressure really all around the roughly 1,000-mile front from north all the way to south through the eastern province, the eastern front all the way down to this area here. But if Russia is able to put them to, the question is going to be, it's literally a fire brigade here, because Ukraine already sent a lot of its strategic reserve into this area here by pulling them off part of the line in some of the quieter zones here. And if we'll have to see, they certainly are sending up in the Kupiansk area, because this did not advance in the last 24 hours from where it was here. So Ukraine is certainly trying to bring its forces in to try and cut this off as well. But they don't have troops. They can't bring a fire brigade from everywhere, because they just don't have it. And so as long as Ukraine has an insufficient number of men, you see it's literally just a matter of time before the Russians are going to continue to advance. Because even in the areas like the Pokrovsk, where they had this big penetration and then had it stopped, it's only stopped for a period of time. I mean, that was the same case with some of these other cities, like Chasiv Yar, for example. It took Russia a long time to be able to take that, but they finally did. Same with Bakhmut, same with Avdiivka, etc. Toretsk, all of these. You remember, we've been talking about these for a long time. Selidova, Ukrainsk, Novohrodivka, all these places eventually did fall, and the Russian side's moved. Much bigger than the territorial acquisition, which has value, but much bigger is the number of Ukraine troops that have died in defending these. And now then, what we've seen here just lately is that it seems that Ukraine and the United States and the Western Europe want to try and compensate for the lack of manpower with more ammunition and weapons. And of course, Trump has continued to send ammunition, even from the old stuff that was in the pipeline during the Biden administration. That even a lot of that is still flowing. There has been a little bit additional new stuff there, and Trump talks about that. And as a matter of fact, he touted just from the White House yesterday that he is actually kind of proud of the fact that we're not actually paying anything more, but the Europeans are. They're the ones who are paying for this. We're just providing the ammunition for them to use.
They request through NATO. We deal with NATO. We don't deal really with Ukraine. NATO requests missiles. They want Patriots. They want missiles. We give the missiles to NATO. NATO pays us in full and does what they want. I mean, I think they give them mostly they can do other things with them too, because we're dealing with NATO. We pay no money to Ukraine. We gave $350 billion to Ukraine.
That's enough right there, Gary, because he just goes on and talks about things that he had done in the past. But the bottom line is, he is reiterating there that we are going to sell stuff to NATO, and then NATO is going to give it to the Ukrainians. Now, that's also similar to some of the deal that President Trump got with an economic deal he did with the European Union at large, where they have to invest a lot of money, and part of their NATO funds and whatnot says that they have to pay up to 3.5% of their own defense systems, and then they also have to spend an additional 1.5 on top of that for a total of 5% of investments, etc. So that's requiring a lot from the European Union or NATO writ large. But there's a problem with that. There's a couple of problems. Number one, even if all the money in the world could be found on the European side, there is a bottleneck on our side. Two bottlenecks, to be specific. One is in our stockpiles. We are already critically low by many open source advances. Information has come out by other sources I have that are beyond that. And they confirm that our stockpiles, especially of the critical ammunition, like artillery pieces, interceptor missiles, and a number of other categories, are critically low right now for what they're supposed to be. That's not just because of what we've given from the Ukraine war, but also what we continue to give for the Israeli fights against practically everybody in the Middle East. All of that continues to drain our coffers. All of our ability to produce ammunition, that is the second bottleneck. We don't have the industrial capacity to scale up to replace our own stockpiles and to keep these other two major wars, which are a major suck on our capabilities. So even if, say, we gave Israel everything they wanted, and there was plenty of money on the Ukraine side and the European side to say, hey, here's this big laundry list, all the things that we want on here, missiles, artillery pieces, tanks, artillery systems, etc. They can ask for that all day long. We don't have it, not at scale. So we have to parse out what we have. Those are two big issues that we have roadblocks in. So if anybody thinks we're going to compensate for the manpower in Ukraine, that they can continue on indefinitely, just keeping the front where it is, and 4 years of incremental draw, like the British said the other day. They did an analysis and claimed it would cost Russia 2 million lives in 4.5 years to be able to take all of the Donbass or something like that. You can make yourself feel better about that, but the battlefield math doesn't line up with those estimates, because that seemed to only calculate just a simplistic, all right, well, it did take them the X to go to Y over Z time frame. And so just drawing a pencil and drawing a straight line out there and saying, oh, okay, well, there you go. It would take another 4 years. And since we claim on our own with no evidence that Russia's lost 500,000 men, so just do this simple direct math, and that's now 4 million. That didn't even calculate the Ukraine side of that calculation, because in whatever the actual number of casualties that Russia has, and it has got to be big. I don't think it's as big as what we claim, but it's not small. And I don't think not even anybody on the Russian side that I know tries to pretend to otherwise. But whatever that number is, it is small in comparison to the casualties inflicted on the Ukraine side, which is logical given the incredible firepower disparity between the two sides and the fact that Russia can build all the things that it needs: ammunition, weapons, bullets, bombs, everything that you can think of, certainly in the drones. Russia has the industrial capacity and the manpower to keep this pressure going. The Ukraine side doesn't. But there's one more problem too, and that is on the European side. So whereas Trump touts that now NATO, he just uses that term, NATO will pay for all this stuff and we'll ship it over there. Problem with some of that deal is it's not NATO, it's individual countries that have to actually provide things. And when you look at a couple of them in particular, and I think this is representative of a whole bunch of European countries, maybe even most of them, there's a problem there. As we're first going to look at Robert Fico from Slovakia.
From the very beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, I have supported all peace initiatives, even if they came from the most distant cosmic sphere. Therefore, I also welcome the latest development because the conflict cannot be resolved militarily. And the nuclear power, which the Russian Federation undoubtedly is, cannot be defeated in the final war. The first basic premise of ending the conflict is the understanding that Ukraine cannot become a member state of the North Atlantic Alliance.
So he's looking very practically. He's saying, look, the reality, Robert Fico is saying out loud what so many in the West, and certainly the power ones in Berlin, Paris, London, they won't say anything about what the truth is. I'll never really understand why they keep with fiction so much of talking like they're in the position of power and dominance over Russia, and Russia's falling apart or whatever, even when people can see with their own eyes that's not the case. But Robert Fico is. Ukraine cannot militarily win. It can't. It can't even hold out. It's impossible to ever contemplate that they could have a military victory, which you saw Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday still claims that they can't. We know he's detached from reality, but Robert Fico is not. So he's saying that. And then he's saying, look, the other thing, when you're talking about a negotiated settlement off the battlefield, he goes, you got to start with, there's not going to be any NATO. He talked about some of the other things, also talking about reality, which to almost, or very few in the West want to say, at least out loud. I think most of them understand the reality behind the scenes, but he was calling that out. So he said, militarily and diplomatically, that's the problem. Well, as Viktor Orban said, actually in a recent interview as well, there's another category that also has to be dealt with, and that's about who's paying for this stuff.
So who made the deal with President Trump? Somebody who has no legitimacy to do so. So it will be never fulfilled, or I don't know who will fulfill that agreement. Then there is a secret chapter of this agreement, if I understand correctly, that's something about Ukraine. And I think this is the most important and most dangerous point. As we are informed, there is a deal that the United States will sell weapons to the Ukrainians in a way that it will be paid by the European Union. But who will pay for that? Because Brussels cannot do so. So again, tariff is one thing, but then there are three other points when the President of the United States made a deal with somebody who has no chance to fulfill that obligation. So I think it will create a lot of difficulties and discourses in the future. Because President Trump will say, why this agreement is not fulfilled? We said, it's not our deal. You made a deal with the President of the Commission. Go there.
So you see, he's saying now, you and Ursula von der Leyen signed this from the European Commission or Mark Rutte from NATO. And he said, yeah, go to them, get them to pay. So the thing is, NATO per se, the headquarters, it's just an administrative organization. It's not a sovereign entity. It doesn't have cash. It doesn't take in funds and issue out funds, etc. The member states do. So you have to have Viktor Orban from Hungary, or from Slovakia, or Romania, or Poland, or Britain, or France, Germany, etc. All these different individual countries, they've all got to agree that who's going to pay for this, because you're asking them to pay for stuff on top of them already having to advance their own industrial, their own capacity in militarily to get up to this total 5% increase in GDP at some point in the future. So you're asking them to double dip when they're already significantly struggling in their domestic economies. And for most part, the people in these countries don't feel like that they're actually threatened by anything. So in order to do this, and this is a big problem in UK right now, where Keir Starmer, of course, he's the biggest cheerleader for Zelensky, but he's having to deal with his own fire brigade issues to put out fires domestically in his backyard, because there's a lot of people saying, man, you're giving all this money to immigrants. That's a big issue in UK. You're giving now money to Zelensky, etc. And then you're cutting services for our people. Our people are struggling to get their bills paid. There's wage stagnation is a big issue there. And they're saying, wait, you keep reducing because you don't have enough money, but you are giving it elsewhere. That's just what I know of in the UK. I can imagine similar concepts like that are going on in other countries, definitely in Slovakia, definitely in Hungary as well. And you see Orban, who is a definite friend of Trump, is not shying away from saying, hey, don't come looking at me. I didn't agree to anything. I did not agree that I'm going to buy stuff for Ukraine. And further in that interview with Robert Fico, he made the same comment. He said, don't come to Slovakia and thinking you're going to ask us to buy stuff and then give it to to Ukraine. We're not going to do that. So I would imagine that that's one of the places where some of the other European states will probably be pretty silent on those two. And of course, they've been kind of outliers anyway. But I think on something like this, they might either get some acquiescence or even some solid or quiet agreement, because I can't imagine that Italy's going to want to pay a bunch of money for weapons that they're not even going to get, as they simultaneously have to pay for an increasing in their military budgets, to keep President Trump happy, etc. So it's one thing to have these really great meetings, and it's one thing to have these signing ceremonies and huge numbers get tossed out around there, like in Japan, South Korea, the European Union, etc. Some of these others, they all look good at the signing ceremony, but then the devil's in the details, as you may understand from watching our show, is what we always go to focus on too, whether it's the physical ground on the battlefield or the physical spreadsheets in different countries. There has to be a reckoning on when it actually gets to the brass tacks. And that is the problem. And you see, I promise you, Hungary and Slovakia are not the only two countries that are saying, we ain't going to pay nothing for Ukraine. I promise you, there's a great many countries in Ukraine and in Europe that will say the same thing. And then, of course, then you get back to the previous bottlenecks I mentioned, which is our ability to produce said weapons in the quantities needed. And you see, added to the lack of manpower on the Ukraine side, this cannot end well. Hence, you can understand why the Russians are in no hurry, why they're they are going slow on the battlefield, but they, as we can see, and actually there's one more video I do want to show you from Weeb Union, because he's talked about something, and this is the first time I've seen it. Maybe it'll be the first time you have as well, is that Russia has not only changed their tactics, and you heard Davidov mention that there's in the first clip we showed you talking about the Kupiansk area, where he said there wasn't a lot of armored vehicles that were used. It was mainly like dune buggies, motorcycles, or just infantrymen on foot. That is reflected also in the losses. Check this out.
There is interesting information. Looking at a graph from RX, which goes through open source information to check out the losses of both the Russians and the Ukrainians, although there's been a lot of criticism towards RX on the reliability of these numbers, the general trend should be accurate, with the Russians losing a lot of vehicles at the start of the conflict, especially the ones that were abandoned and captured in the first few months of the conflict, following which it was much more damaged, destroyed, and abandoned. But towards the end, the last 10 months, there has been a steady decline in losses of artillery and tanks for the Russians, but especially over the last 6 months, there's been a significant decline in all three losses.
So you see artillery pieces, infantry fighting carriers, and tanks. There's been a significant decline in the losses the Russians have. And that's probably for one of two reasons, maybe a little bit of each. One is that Russia sees, hey, just driving around a lot of armored vehicles draws attention. They're easier for enemy drones to find and to target. It's a lot easier to infiltrate individual people because they have to be seen. You may have seen some of these videos here recently where a lot of the Russians are using what they call invisibility cloaks. They're actually not invisibility cloaks, but there are things that have thermal damping on them, and if they're used properly for a period of time, it can get a soldier moving on the ground. Where at night, where the thermal drones that have thermal imaging devices can't see them because they don't. It doesn't. The heat isn't seen like that is the normal case there if it's just a person. They're not always foolproof because there's videos of some of the guys thinking that they're covered and they're actually not, because if you use it too long, then your heat actually will go through that and it'll be seen anyway. But it's working on the ground, and whether it's that or whether it's these dune buggies you may have seen some of, or the motorcycles. Recall also a show we did some weeks ago where we talked about how the Russian side is using new and innovative ways for counter-drone capabilities. Russia's doing a lot of drone-to-drone warfare where they're physically knocking them out of the sky, et cetera. There's some lasers that are coming up, so that's reducing the Ukraine effectiveness. But then in terms of the troops on the ground, they said speed is the key here. So like with the motorcycle, you can zigzag. With the dune buggy, you can go in just this odd, quickly changing dynamics, et cetera. Whereas an armored vehicle, it's easy to see and it's clunky to maneuver, et cetera. So Russia's saying, hey, this is just the old-fashioned way of just moving infantrymen and infantry fighting vehicles up to the front to protect them, which is historically the way it had been working. Now is anywhere near as effective. So they're finding new ways to do it. That's one thing. Possibly another one is that Russia is saying, hey, because this is not that effective here, we want to hold them in reserve until we can get a breakthrough. Because the reason why the armored vehicles are vulnerable in the line of contact area is because you have, if here's the line of contact right here, some distance, some number of kilometers back on either side, you have the operators who are able to move these drones up with the line of sight or with the spool from the fiber optic drones or the range from the radio on the other FPV drones, et cetera. And that's how far you can go in there. So you have to be very careful getting your armored vehicles up in there. But if you're able to effect a breakthrough at some point, whether that's in the Zaporizhia, Kupiansk, or the Pokrovsk area, or some other place in the future, if they can effect a breakthrough there so they get beyond that 6 mile area or 6 to 10 kilometer area where the drone operators are, and you can get into the rear, now then you can open a corridor and you can drive large numbers of vehicles in, like what happened in the original invasion in February of 2022. In that time, you had 5 axes of advance of the Russian forces coming in from all different sides, and they literally rolled and drove into the countryside because the defenses weren't set up at that time. Drones were just a fraction of what they are right now. If you get into a future situation where you have a breakthrough, and again, you can drive into an area where there aren't defensive positions set up, where you don't have a lot of drone operators and they're not set up for it, then you can have a massive move. It, again, remains to be seen if that's what the Russians are going to do, but that is what they, one of the potentials for what we observe on the battlefield could allow them to do. In any case, these potentialities are really secondary and tertiary from what the primary one is, that Russia can just continue to grind down the Ukraine side because there's not enough money. We can't make enough weapons, and the Ukraine side can't manufacture men. They can just continue to steal them off the streets, and there's just not enough of them anymore. Whereas on the Russian side, in every category, manpower, the ability to make their own weapons, and the ability to pay for them, because they've got it from their own budget, because obviously it's them. They're at war, so they'll sacrifice whatever they need to make sure that they pay. Getting money is not a problem for the Russians. They can manufacture it on their own resources. In that case, even if none of these breakthroughs ever happen, Russia can eventually grind down the Ukraine side. It's just a mathematical, something close to a mathematical certainty. There's always the possibility of a political thing that could happen, or a breakthrough diplomatic venture could be launched, or something like that. But only something of that nature will change, because without an intervention from the outside diplomatically to stop the Russian army on the ground, it is a certainty that at some point Russia will simply grind down the Ukraine side. How long that'll going to take, again, it's impossible for me to know. It could be literally a matter of months. It could also be a couple of years. All those things are possible, because I don't have enough information to be able to say, because I don't know about the status of the Ukraine armed forces, how they're fighting, what their morale is, any of those kinds of things. But I can tell you that historically, either of those two things are possible. But no, the only question is, will Ukraine die fast or will they die slow? Because that is virtually certain at this point. And unfortunately, the longer it takes for the Ukrainian, the European, and maybe even in the American people to come to that realization, I fear that we may not, until there is either just a wholesale collapse somewhere where the Ukraine side just is not able to defend itself anymore. Just they don't have enough men, and it's not just that they don't have a fire brigade to go anywhere else, but they, even in a certain area of the front, they just don't have enough men to cover it, and Russia just rolls into it. I can't say, but I fear that it'll take something like that for the West to finally recognize it, even though the logic is pretty much there for anyone to see who's willing to see things as they really are, as Viktor Orban does, as Robert Fico does, and as the Daniel Davis Deep Dive does. We've been telling you this from the beginning, and unfortunately, it's playing out in grossly slow motion, painfully slow motion, because of the supreme cost to the Ukraine side as it does. That's our show for you today, folks. We really appreciate you joining us today. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.